25 years later, same name, different game. Metal Gear.
The Metal Gear series turns 25 this year, so what better time to cover the game that started it all, Hideo Kojima's original spy thriller, Metal Gear.
You probably know the history by now, but in 1987, a young game designer at Konami named Hideo Kojima was asked to take over a project called Metal Gear. It was to be an action game for the MSX2 home computer, which Konami published a great many titles for. There was only one problem. The MSX2 home computer couldn't scroll, which Kojima felt would hamper its ability to serve up a competent action game, so he changed the focus to stealth, a lone soldier sent into enemy territory to disarm the nuclear threat known as Metal Gear.
His bosses didn't exactly go for it, but Kojima was already getting frustrated at Konami, having just come off of Penguin Adventure. He decided it was time to put up or shut up. So he decided to keep putting up. Needless to say, things worked out.
In July of 1987, Metal Gear was released for the MSX2 in Japan, with a European release following in September. It caught on quickly with owners of the system, and because of its success, it was quickly slated for release on the Nintendo Famicom. The Famicom version was released that December in Japan, and came to the NES in the United States in 1988.
And those are our two games for this episode. Metal Gear for the NES, and the enhanced port of the MSX2 version of Metal Gear that's found on the second disc of Metal Gear Solid 3 Subsistence for the PlayStation 2. This same version is also found on the current generation's Metal Gear Solid HD collection, which is available for PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, and PlayStation Vita.
It merits mentioning that the NES port of Metal Gear was not worked on by Hideo Kojima in any capacity, and features a number of differences we will get to, but suffice it to say, as far as Hideo Kojima is concerned, this is not the game he made, and the differences and details about the characters contained therein are not considered canon.
In order to understand the differences more fully, we're going to start with the original. Now, a few notes before we get started. On my playthrough, I used the bandana item. Now, that item gives Snake infinite ammo for all of his weapons, just like it does in the Metal Gear Solid series. This item is not available in the original MSX2 version, only in the enhanced port. The other thing is that this has a fuller and richer translation than the original English version, which was released in Europe in 1987. Other than that though, gameplay-wise, graphics-wise, it is the same as the MSX2 home computer version of Metal Gear.
The game opens with our hero, Solid Snake, swimming into outer heaven, on a mission to rescue Gray Fox, the best agent in his elite combat unit, Foxhound. Then, to save Dr. Petrovich Modnar, creator of the Metal Gear, and then stop the tank itself from being deployed. Snake proceeds through 3 buildings that make up the complex while completing his missions, taking orders from his commanding officer Big Boss, and corner punching a lot of dudes. A lot of dudes get corner punched in this game.
This game is still extremely playable today, and went a long ways to establish things about Metal Gear, the series, in terms of both gameplay systems as well as narrative.
For example, Snake can equip one item and one weapon at a time. He goes in unarmed, he can use his fists and a gun at the same time, and there are a lot of boss battles with unique strategies. Now, the game does a very good job of guiding you, with the exception of a sequence that follows the rescue of Gray Fox. It's difficult to know what you're supposed to do after that. Where to go. It's definitely not obvious that you need to punch walls and then use plastic explosives to bomb them in the basement. Eventually, you can get into a room where you find the bomb blast suit that you then need to get on the roof. Once you deal with that, though, it's pretty smooth sailing. NPCs will guide you from goal to goal, and while there's some backtracking, it's pretty well explained and someone will tell you where you need to go and why, so there isn't a lot of blind fumbling between goals. You also progress as the difficulty increases by gaining levels based on how many hostages you save. The more you save, the higher your rank gets, and the more equipment and ammunition you can carry.
And that's what really makes this game stand out. Even great retro games like the original Legend of Zelda don't always do a great job of pointing you in the right direction. But Metal Gear shows you where to go without being too dumbed down or holding your hand.
The game even contains the trademark Kojima twist, wherein it's discovered that Big Boss is the leader of Outer Heaven and has betrayed Foxhound. Want to know why? Well, you're going to have to play a few more games to figure that out. But the point is that at the end, Snake destroys Metal Gear, saves Dr. Modner and his daughter, and Gray Fox, and escapes from Outer Heaven.
On the surface, this game is essentially the same as the original. Snake goes in, rescues Gray Fox, kills Big Boss, and escapes. What could go wrong? Well, I'm going to tell you what could go wrong. But before I rip into this game, and believe me, I'm going to rip into this game, but before I do, let me just say that without this version of Metal Gear being released in America, this series may never have reached the levels of popularity or notoriety that it eventually did. So even if this game has some problems, and it does have problems, it's a good thing that it made it to our shores.
Sure, Konami may still have released Metal Gear Solid for the PlayStation in the United States, and the story may have ended the same way. Or maybe, with Western audiences knowing nothing about the series, Konami wouldn't have spent the pile of money needed to localize Metal Gear Solid, and the series would have stayed in Japan. It's hard to say. Either way, the NES Metal Gear was the only version to come to North America at the time of its release, and it got me hooked, even though I could never finish it at the time. Okay, so the differences. Well, we can start right at the beginning, because the very opening of the game is totally different. In this version, Snake parachutes in with what appear to be 3 other operatives. These operatives are never given names, never mentioned in the manual or the game text, and never ever referred to again outside of this opening sequence. Now, does Snake parachute onto the roof of one of these buildings? Of course not. That would be too easy. He drops right into the middle of the damn jungle, and then he has to work his way to Building 1, all the while avoiding guards who feel asleep, and then hop into a truck that have started to move to get him to that first building. The jungle sequences are pointless. They add nothing to the overall experience and serve only to be frustrating. They also added another building to this version, and Building 4, the extra one, can only be found after dicking around in the jungle. It's just busy work. It kills the pacing. Anyways, the buildings themselves are laid out similarly to the MSX2 version, but not identically, and the checkpoints are really wonky, letting you keep all of your gear when continuing, but sometimes taking you all the way back to Solid Snake's initial drop zone. Speaking of your gear, much of it is found in totally different areas. Well, some is the same, but again, the changes seem arbitrary at best and cruel at worst. Here's an example of just how arbitrary it gets. The NES game adds an item called the Iron Glove. Its purpose? To allow you to hit walls and find out which can be blown up with the plastic explosive. However, the telltale noise to let you know which walls can be blown up sounds whether or not you have the stupid fucking glove, so why even bother?
There isn't one single change, not one change that I can cite, made to this game from the MSX2 original that makes it better. Not one improvement. Nothing makes it less complex, nothing makes it easier to navigate, nothing makes it more interesting. But the biggest and most insulting change? That's as much as you're going to see of the Metal Gear itself, right there on the label. Because the tank itself is never in the game.
I'm not kidding. The Metal Gear, the walking tank capable of launching a nuclear strike from anywhere, is never seen in the NES game. In the MSX2 version, you find the tank before it's activated, and you're required to use plastic explosives on the feet, which is where Dr. Modner tells you the armor is the weakest. There's a specific pattern required for some reason, but It adds some strategy to the mission. The tank itself doesn't move, but there are 2 lasers behind it that can zap Snake from the wall. But at least you get to see what all the fuss is about. In the NES game, you bomb the mainframe computer that controls the Metal Gear. Well, what good does that do? There's still a walking nuclear tank out there somewhere. It seems like it would be easier to just build a new control computer than a whole new tank, which, of course, they do anyways. Were they just too lazy to draw the Metal Gear for the NES version? Again, in the MSX2 version, it doesn't move, so why would the giant sprite of a computer be any more memory intensive than a sprite of the Metal Gear? Stupid!
Both games end with a mano-a-mano fight against Big Boss himself, then an escape sequence, so at least the final boss encounter is intact. Now, let's talk about some tangibles, graphics, and sound.
We've already covered the MSX2 home computer's inability to scroll, which the NES of course had, but this game doesn't use it. In terms of the display, however, the MSX2 is pretty far ahead of the NES. The NES had a palette of 54 colors, 25 of which could be displayed simultaneously at a resolution of up to 256 by 240. The MSX2, however, had a color palette of 512 colors, 16 of which could display at once with a maximum resolution of 512 by 212. This difference becomes very obvious when the games are seen here side by side. Musically, the tracks were completely changed for the NES game, except for the boss music. Other than that, all the tracks, from the intro music to the main theme to the alert theme, they were all redone completely. Both soundtracks are good, and it's really hard to pick a favorite.
Alright, it's time to give the edge. This one is no contest. It's the MSX2 version all the way. The NES game isn't that terrible. It's a little obtuse, but it's not a bad game, but it's like Blade Runner. Would you ever watch the original theatrical cut of Blade Runner now that the Final Cut version is so easy to come by? Of course you wouldn't. In the 80s, we didn't know what we were missing. Now we do. This version is available, like I said, on the Metal Gear Solid HD collection for 360, PS3, and PlayStation Vita. There's no reason not to go check it out. Alright, well that wraps up this episode of Same Name Different Game. Make sure to check out our next episode, our Halloween special, which will be posted as part of our 31 More Days of Horror Games feature going on right now at onthestick.com. So make sure you check back every day for a new article from myself, my podcasting compatriots, and a ton of other contributors that help make our site so awesome. We'll see you next time.